27.3. Well, actually, it was higher than that in the Second World War because so many European countries were relatively knocked out. But 15.1%. Europe, 13.1%. You'll note this. China's economy in 2030, which is only 18 years or whatever it is down the road, 17 years down the road, will be twice the size of the American economy and over twice the size of the European economy. So, to proceed, I'll come back to that in a moment. This is what the economy, well, the global economy could look like in 2030. Japan just 3%, Russia 3%, Brazil 5%, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam and so on 6%, EU 13%, America 15%, India, which I haven't talked about, 19%, and China 34%. And if I paint the picture like this for you, the top one is GDP at current exchange rates, the bottom one is GDP at PPP, and the red ball is China, and the grey silver ball is the United States. And you'll see this extraordinary historical transformation. I mean, we're talking about only 30 years between the red ball being very, very small, almost like, not like the moon around the Earth, to becoming not yet the sun, but I mean much bigger than the American economy. And Danny Quah at the London School of Economics has put this interesting, done some very interesting work on trying to locate the epicenter of the global economy and how it's shifting. And in 1980, he had it, you know, in the Eastern Atlantic here, and then it steadily shifted. And at the moment, he suggests it's just here. And by 2050, he suggests it'll be on the Indian-Chinese border. This is an extraordinary historic shift that's taking place. You know, this was when the world was still dominated by the North Atlantic, in a sense, and this is how it is changing. And it's changing in another sense as well, just to go back to this. And that's this. Look, what characterizes this era is not just the rise of China. It's also characterized by the transformation in the position of the developing world. If you go back to the 1970s, the mid-1970s, the developed world accounted for 2/3 of global GDP, the developing world only 1/3. Bear in mind that 85% of the world's population lives in the developing world, and only 15% lives, roughly speaking, lives in the developed world. By 2000, it was roughly 50-50. Huang Gong's projection is that the developing world will account for 2/3 of global GDP by 2030. So the great transformation we're talking about, in which China is the leader, but is also the exemplar and is part of the wider phenomenon of the rise of the developing world and the decline of the developed world. That is the era that we live in. And the world is being and will be reconstituted by this process. In my view, we will see the existing international institutions either transformed or replaced, or both, is what I suspect will happen, is both. Because the new rising powers will want to constitute the world over time in a different kind of way. So, that brings me to the end of my economic paration, because I want to move on and talk about China. What is China? You know, the economic stuff sort of enables us to think that China is very familiar to us and we know what it is and it's going to be like us. I mean, it doesn't, of course, we've got it wrong so many times. But there's a sort of ease of translation, or we think there's an ease of translation. Now, what about China as a country, as a history? as a nation. How to understand that? Now, the West has always thought, or has long thought, that there is only one modernity. And that modernity is a Western modernity. And that as countries modernize, they westernize. They become more and more like us. We're all on the upper escalator. We're just on different steps on that escalator. So as China modernizes, it will become just like us. This is an illusion. This is profoundly wrong. This is based on the assumption somehow the process of modernization is simply a function of competition, markets and technology. It is not. It is also a function of history and culture. China has never been Western. It is not Western now, and it never will be Western. I don't mean that it's not learning like crazy from us. I don't mean that it's not incorporated significant parts of that learning into what China is. But the end product will not be a Western style country. It will be something different. Now, this is where we're all at sea, because we don't think like this. We think that Western concepts, Western ideas, drawn from our own history, drawn from our experience, can explain what China is. I'm sorry, it only has a limited capacity to do that. And I refer here not just to general, media stuff and so on. I refer to a lot of China scholarship by, China experts in the West. I mean, in varying degrees, but there are great exceptions like Lucien Pai, who I think was a great scholar of China, who was at MIT. Now, what I want to do, the main thing I want to do today, before I get onto the UK and where we're going to be, is to try and give you some building blocks for understanding China. And I'm going to give you, as quickly as I can, 5 key building blocks for understanding China. The first is this. China is a nation state. But it's only called itself a nation state for the last century, bit more than a century. Anyone who knows anything about China knows that it is a lot older than a century. Over 2,000 years ago, with the victory of the Qin dynasty at the end of the warring state periods, you began to get the unification of China. And these are very crude maps, but this is roughly what the Qin dynasty looked like against the borders of modern China. The southern line of the red line is modern China. And if you go back, if you go on to the next dynasty, which lasted a lot longer, the Han dynasty, which is we're still talking about over 2,000 years ago. And there are the borders of the Han dynasty. So China has existed within, roughly, broadly speaking, its present borders. I mean, these parts of China were added much later, under the Qin dynasty in the 17th century. The vast majority of Chinese live in this area then and now. Now, the fascinating thing here is this. China, the Chinese, the way the Chinese think of themselves, what it means to be Chinese, the way they think of what China is not a function of the last 100 years of being a nation state. It is a function of more than 2,000 years of being a civilization, or what I call a civilization state. China is primarily not a nation state. It is primarily a civilization state, and only secondarily a nation state. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about things like Confucian values, very unusual relationship, unique relationship in many ways between the state and society. Very unusual conception of the family. Social customs like guanxi, ancestral worship, an ideographic language. Chinese food, chopsticks. I mean, all these things are not a function of the last 100 years. Now, here you have an absolutely basic difference between China and Western countries. Western countries are constituted on the basis, fundamentally or predominantly, varies from country to country, but always predominantly on the basis of national identity, on the basis of nation state. China is different. China is first and foremost constituted on the basis of civilization. It has absolutely far-reaching implications. You cannot understand the Chinese state without a concept of Chinese civilization and the civilization state. You cannot understand the Chinese attitude towards race, which in many ways is very different from what predominates in the West, without understanding this notion of Chinese civilization. I mean, the whole evolution of the Han as a concept, as a construct, as a race, and so on. So this is absolutely point of departure for understanding China. I'm going to give you one very, very quick example of this because I could go on. It's such a fascinating subject with what seems to me enormous implications. But Westerners don't really get it. Well, I did a talk in India. In fact, I did a series of talks in India. And for India, it's very different from China, but they got it. They got it in a way that the Westerners don't get it, because we have no experience of this. But India has, and many other countries in the developing world have some sense of what I was talking about here. Now, remember 1997, handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China? And you may remember the Chinese offer was one country, two systems. And I don't think any of us really understood what the hell the Chinese were on, us being in the West, understood what the Chinese were really on about when they were making this proposal and what it would mean. I think we probably thought, well, when China gets its hands on Hong Kong, it'll just be like the rest of the People's Republic of China. It's just window dressing until they get their hands on it. Well, we were so darn wrong, weren't we? Because today, Hong Kong is as different from the rest of the PRC as it was in 1997. They meant it. They meant it. Why did we get it wrong? We got it wrong because we have a nation-state logic. What's a nation-state logic? One nation, one system. German unification after 1989. What happened? East Germany disappeared. Reconstituted on the basis of West Germany, the new Germany. It was a perfectly logical way of doing it for Germany, because Germany is a nation state, but China is not a nation state. China is primarily a civilization state. It is impossible to run a country of this extraordinary size and diversity on the basis of rule from Beijing, and everything is the same. It's a this is a continent. This has got 1.3 billion people. That province those four provinces together have a population larger than that of the United States. Those 9 provinces there each have a population larger than that of Britain or France. It is vast. It varies enormously, not just economically, but also politically, culturally, or in many different ways. The only way that China could run is on the basis of actually one civilization, several systems. So this has got enormous importance. Okay, I'll stop talking about civilization state now, but it's such an interesting subject I'd like to carry on. The second example I want to take is about the family. Now we think, often people in the West think, well, the process of the growth of individualism in society is a generic global trend, and every country will go in the same direction and become, in a sense, like we have done. And it is certainly true, that young Chinese, there's all sorts of, whatever I say about history, one's always got to remember that China is changing at the speed of light, and the